Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz here. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is visiting Southeast Asia, starting with Singapore. He is the first member of President Joe Biden's cabinet to visit the region. Observers say he will be seeking to emphasize the importance Washington places on strengthening ties in the region while pushing back against China. The United States has put countering China at the heart of its national security policy. In March, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called a rivalry with Beijing the biggest geopolitical test of this century. For their part, the Southeast Asian countries are still looking for details of Biden's strategy, as well as his specific plans for economic, trade, and military engagement with the Indo-Pacific. Meanwhile, China's vice foreign minister has accused the U.S. of creating an imaginary enemy. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, the second-ranking U.S. diplomat, also had face-to-face meetings with China's State Counselor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. U.S. State Department said that Sherman laid out U.S. concerns over China's actions on issues ranging from Hong Kong and Xinjiang to Tibet and cyber attacks. Senior administration officials also added that China should not approach areas of global concern such as climate and Afghanistan on a transactional basis. Clearly, the tone is getting more confrontational, a continuing trend since former U.S. President Donald Trump's one-term presidency. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Roly Lal, Associate Professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs, Victor Gao, a Chinese international relations expert and translator. Mr. Gao is a director of the China National Association of International Studies, and Dr. Christopher Ankerson, Clinical Associate Professor at New York University. Thank you to all my panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Gao here. Mr. Gao, China says the U.S. is creating an imaginary enemy. The United States says China is projecting power and is on a road to modernizing its military and putting pressure on the littoral states in South China Sea. So give me your first impressions of what's going on here, and then we can get to some specifics.
Thank you very much for having me. I think indeed there are people in Washington who have not come to terms with the imminent prospect and the reality of a China which is larger than the United States as an economy and probably more impactful on the global stage. And there are people in Washington who are bent upon holding China down as if there will be no consequences, even at the risk of launching a war against China. So they imagine China as an enemy of the United States. They want to stand in the way of China's peaceful rise, and they fabricate all kinds of false accusations, including, in the worst form, the so-called genocide in China's Xinjiang autonomous region. So from the Chinese perspective, the United States is increasingly losing its sanity and barking at the wrong tree. And China believes no political force anywhere in the world can stand in the way of Chinese people's peaceful development, and China's rise is inevitable. And in less than 10 years' time, the Chinese economy by official exchange rate measurement will be larger than that of the United States. And the Chinese economy, using purchasing power parity, has been larger than the United States for more than a couple of years. So decision-making makers in Washington need to come back to their sanity and come to terms with a China peacefully rising and eventually surpassing that of the United States. This is a megatrend we are living through in our time, and don't stand in the way of the megatrend.
Right. Now, Mr. Gao, before I go to Professor Lal and Ankerson, let me just invoke your own background. You were very close to the late Deng Xiaoping, and you recall that Deng had this way of, modernizing China, but staying below the radar. With Xi, there is a general sense around the world that Xi is saying, well, China has arrived. and you have to reckon with that. Now, specifically saying, while China talks about connectivity, the Belt Road Initiative, as a matter of fact, its flagship is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. There are states within South China Sea, the Philippines, Vietnam. I had people from Indonesia, Malaysia on my program saying, this so-called 9-dash line, they refer to the fact that, the International Arbitration Tribunal had essentially educated against the Chinese historical position with reference to the so-called 9-dash line and the islands. So there is a sense that China is projecting power, that China is now embarked on its own Monroe Doctrine. Is that impression correct?
Absolutely not. I think this is really confounding the realities on the ground with such false accusations. Why? Please keep in mind, when Japan unconditionally surrendered in 1949, Japan was sitting on all the islands and reefs and isles in the South China Sea completely. And do you know to whom the Japanese aggressors surrendered all these islands, isles, and reefs in the South China Sea? They surrendered it to the Republic of China troops with the help of the American troops. And back in 1945, when Japan unconditionally surrendered, then at that time there was no Indonesia. Indonesia was a Dutch colony at that time. There was no Malaysia. Malaysia was a British colony. There was no the Philippines. The Philippines was occupied by the Japanese, and eventually it was retaken by the United States. There was no Vietnam at the time. Vietnam was a French colony. China was the only independent sovereign country in this part of the world. And Japan surrendered all the islands and reefs and isles in the South China Sea to the Republic of China. And when the United States took over the Philippines, they took over every bit and pieces which belonged to the Philippines, because the Philippine boundary was well demarcated as the result of the war between Spain and the United States, and as the result of the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. So let's talk about the reality. All such false accusations against China sounded like China was encroaching into the Gulf of Mexico. We are talking about South China Sea. And back in 1945, China, the Republic of China at that time, was the only independent sovereign country in this part of the world.
Okay, right. Let me pull Dr. Oli Lal on this. Professor Lal, clearly there is a lot of discrepancy between the positions that the US and its allies take and the position that China takes. So give me your view of course, you've heard Victor Gao. So give me your view of how you look at the Chinese position and, of course, the continuation of the US policy of looking at China as a peer competitor.
Well, I mean, I think there's no way to, doubt the fact that China is a competitor for the U.S. and the U.S. is recognizing that, and the Chinese recognize that. But I think that's something that needs to really be thought about more in the U.S. and in China, is how to try to break that cycle of a sort of a negative competition and bring it more cooperative. Now, some of this also has to do with, I think, some mistakes that both governments are making. I think if the U.S. wants to be threatened by China as a pure competitor, it should really look internally. I think that the Biden administration is making good moves towards trying to make education more affordable for Americans. I think that would make the U.S. a much better competitor of China. Now, having said that, and of course dealing with our own, human rights issues and so forth in the U.S., I think that we should always move to strengthen ourselves first. Now, having said that, when you look at China, you can kind of see some of the reasons why there are distrust from the U.S. and other allies. When you look at China's moves internally, the whole issue of Xinjiang, as Mr. Gao mentioned, this is something that the international community is very concerned about, protecting Muslim rights, protecting Tibetan rights in China. I think that there's definitely a fundamental disagreement about what's going on internally. And you would think that maybe that doesn't matter internationally, but it does, because the US and the rest of the world is looking at China and saying, okay, what is it that you really believe in? When you have relations with other cultures, with whether they're internal or external, what is your basic mode of operating? And I think that China can probably show a little bit better what its intentions are by looking internally and dealing with some of these issues in a more democratic manner. I think that will help a lot in the future.
Right. I'm sure Gao is taking note of what you're saying with reference to Xinjiang. But, Professor Lal, there is also a sense that when it comes to human rights issues, great powers are pretty good at cherry picking, in the sense that, try as they might with the State Department coming up with reports, whether it's with reference to religious discrimination, whether it's about human rights, but at the level of the apex, it's more about geopolitics than human rights per se. For instance, there are a number of other places, abutting Tibet, for instance, and Xinjiang is what we in Pakistan call the occupied and now illegally annexed Kashmir, where a number of reports, including by Genocide Watch, have talked about what the Indian government is doing. So we don't hear much from the Biden administration, quite possibly because India is a strategic partner. So there's a sense that it's not the position is not very consistent.
To be frank, I would say that when it comes to international affairs, yes, nothing is consistent for any set of countries, because all countries are always looking out for their own national interests when it comes down to it. But again, having said that, when it comes to whether it's China or India, I think that the U.S. is really trying to find a way to move forward positively, and that's what it should do. I do think that with China, there have been some missteps in the sense that you can see that both sides are on the defensive already, and this is just the start of really the Biden administration. I think we need to move away from that and try to move towards, hey, how can we talk more cooperatively? In terms of Pakistan and India, I think that the U.S., yes, it has decided years ago that strategically it has to work closely with India. That doesn't mean that the U.S. doesn't want to work closely with Pakistan. Pakistan also has several domestic situations that it needs to deal with as well, that the U.S. has some frustrations with, and that has deteriorated some of the ability for the U.S. intelligence community to feel like it's cooperating. Now, having said that, I think that there are a lot of areas that they'll be able to work together in the future, both U.S. Pakistan, U.S. India, and U.S. China. And it's just going to take a lot more work on getting that. It's strange, but just getting that positive type of conversation going can go a long way. The discussions in Alaska showed that just setting the first bad foot forward ruined the discussions as a whole. And I think that was a mistake. Because these are formal discussions. They should be, taken very positively. There are problems. And, like I said, Xinjiang and Tibet are going to be big problems. The COVID issue, it's going to be a problem. But, how do we work together on the big issues like climate change?
Right. Before I go, Professor Ankerson, as I said in my opening, Secretary Austin is there in Southeast Asia. Wendy Sherman is in China, and Anthony Blinken is in India. So there seems to be a diplomatic push by the Biden administration. Professor Ankerson, give me your thoughts. You heard Victor Gao, you've heard Professor Lal. Give me your sense of where the U.S.-China relations are headed, and whether we are going to take the structural realist position and say, well, this is inevitable, or there can be some kind of lock-in cooperative framework that Professor Lal is talking about.
First, I have to say, I think you're absolutely right that we can talk about a relationship that can be reframed in some way. And there is a fair amount of flexibility to label this as a relationship of competitors, a relationship of adversaries, and potentially even as enemies. So there is a degree of choice here. I don't believe that there's an inevitability. And we do see, as Dr. Lau has mentioned, a lot of posturing now via rhetoric on all sides about trying to establish maybe the opening salvo or the opening position of that relationship, whether we're going to use words like enemy, whether we're going to talk about smashing people's faces on the Great Wall, for example. There have been a lot of inflammatory rhetoric that is unhelpful. But again, even that, I don't think locks us into an inevitable position. I would say I don't think it's helpful to label the US or any of the other actors here as insane. I think that sets us up for a difficult position to actually have a proper dialogue. That being said, I do agree with Mr. Gao that the U.S. is having a difficult time coming to reckon with this idea of a powerful China. How are they going to deal with issues of actual mutual concern? There is a lot of talk from Anchorage on through about this idea that there are possibilities of cooperation on things like, for example, climate change. I think that those, let's call them functional or topical areas that there is promise for, we erode that promise by having more inflammatory rhetoric in other dimensions. You're absolutely right that all countries tend to cherry pick issues, the issues of human rights. There are certainly issues all around the world where everybody could improve their record on human rights, and the intentional focusing on that and using it as a stick to poke someone in their eye, for example, really does start to get people's hackles up and really does block pathways for a more mature appreciation of what this relationship, which is, as Mr. Gao says, going to be the most important relationship moving forward.
It's very interesting that Professor Lal and Professor Ankerson have talked about the imperative of a cooperative framework, which frankly, going by what I read, and at one time I was kind of part of that inside the Beltway policy-making thing when I was at Brookings, is very different from what we get from there. One sees that that's the kind of material or analyses that actually feed into policy making. But Mr. Gao, you've heard Professor Lal and Professor Ankerson, and they seem to suggest that mistakes are being made on both sides, that perhaps there is need to sort of put one's foot on the brake and take a pause and say, well, okay, let's look at it in a different way, and perhaps there are things that Beijing needs to do which it's not doing, but must do in order for greater trust building. And similarly, ditto for the United States. Now, is that a kind of framework that you think sounds reasonable and something on which the future U.S.-China relations can be built?
Well, I think a key message from the Tianjin meeting, Wendy's chairman and her Chinese counterpart in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, plus the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, should be that China made it very clear this time to the American side. They submitted a list of issues that they demand that the United States deal with immediately. And the key message is, if the United States want China to cooperate on a range of issues, stop treating China as an imaginary or presumptive enemy. And if you treat China as an imaginary enemy or presumptive enemy, China will stop cooperating with the United States at all. This is really a revolutionary message that China is delivering to the United States. Leave it or take it. It's your choice. Don't treat me as an enemy, because if you treat me as an enemy, you will have none of the cooperation you want. And if you stop treating me as an enemy, then China can cooperate with the United States on a whole range of issues, domestic, bilateral, international, you name it. Now, allow me to add one point. China is the strongest and most committed supporter and friend of the Arab people, of the Muslim people, You ask a typical Palestinian or a Pakistani brother or sister or a Syrian or an Iraqi, for example, China is really very committed to the Arab causes and the Islamic causes. So any false accusation against China in Xinjiang aimed at splitting China's relations with the Arab people or the Muslim people are doomed to failure. Now, the other thing is that
Mr. Gao, let me interject here. This is without prejudice to what you're saying, but as Professor Lal said, is there space for or a rethink in Beijing that, okay, since we're being accused of X, Y, Z, perhaps we can ask the outside world to come and see for themselves, what China is doing in Xinjiang? Is there some space for that?
The record in Xinjiang is clear. The Uyghur population, and the Uyghurs are our brothers and sisters, it's an important part of our national fabric. The Uyghur population has increased from 1950, from 1978, from 1990, from 2000, from 2018, from 2021, 2020 to 21. Now, if anyone believes that genocide is based on an ever-increasing size of the population, I think that kind of false accusation is the biggest crime against the Chinese people. Why? Because they are holding out a false accusation. They want to dump such accusation on the head of the Chinese people, and they are completely disregarding the realities on the ground in Xinjiang. I would say our Muslim brothers and sisters in Xinjiang, including our Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, you name it, lots of them, they are living in peace and stability in Xinjiang, rather than being victimized by the extremism that spilled over from Afghanistan. Keep in mind, Xinjiang borders with Afghanistan, and the 20-year war in Afghanistan caused a lot of radicalization inside Afghanistan. It caused the spillover into countries like Pakistan, into regions like China's Xinjiang region. There were lots of Muslims in Xinjiang who wanted to go to Afghanistan to fight jihad against the foreign occupiers. That is the American troops and the NATO troops. What the Chinese government has done over the years is to seal off the border between Xinjiang and Afghanistan, preventing such the Muslims leaving Xinjiang to fight against the Americans and the Uyghur and the NATO soldiers in Afghanistan. And now look at what these countries have done to China. They now accuse China of genocide. I have
so you're saying
false accusation
that's a very interesting
against the Chinese people is a crime against the Chinese people.
Okay, now that's a very interesting point. So you basically saying that while China acted responsibly and did not allow radicalism to sort of get to Afghanistan, and where these people would have fought the U.S. and its allies and their troops, now the U.S. is turning around and blaming China. Now, that's an important and very interesting point. Let me take this to Professor Lal here. Professor Lal, I think one thing that is generally talked about with reference to Xinjiang has to do with the sinicization of the ethnic Uyghurs and other ethnicities. So if you could sort of throw some light on that, and what Mr. Gao said with reference to how China sealed the border and not let the radical Uyghur Muslims enter Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think these are very important issues. I think when we're looking at religious and ethnic minorities such as the Uyghurs, we have to think that at the time of Chinese independence and at the time when the entire country was unified, the Uyghurs were promised, by the way, by Mao Zedong to have their own ethnic independence inside China. Now, soon after that, there was begun a lot of, sort of control over their Islamic belief and prayer structures, oversight over the mosques. And in more recent years, we're seeing, of course, this massive sort of importing of Han Chinese into Xinjiang. So you have, yes, there still is a population of Uyghurs. I don't think anyone is saying that they've all been eliminated. However, there have been the institution of these re-education camps where the Uyghurs are expected to forego their own language and instead really focus on Han culture, Han language. They're being told they should not, be focused on things like eating halal food. Anyone that visits a mosque is suspect. Surveillance is being used on the entire population. You have labor camps in the, and the re-education camps that are trying to get people to believe in a certain way. And the fact of the matter is that this is not what the Uyghurs signed on to, right? So Xinjiang really wanted to have its own region where they can have some pride in their own culture, pride, be able to pray on their own. And, I mean, I don't think that, I know many Uyghurs, and they're not religiously radical in any way, shape, or form. So I do think that, there is space for China to give more autonomy to Xinjiang and deal with the human rights issue. They're much more balanced. I do think that right now China is using a two-front sort of approach where it's very happy with the Arab countries, it's working well with Pakistan, but with regard to its own Muslim population, I'm afraid it has been dropping the ball. Now, with regards to the border with Afghanistan, I think it's very good that they have kept a closed border. You don't want to have a lot of spillover over there. But having said that, I think that, again, it's a larger issue. All the countries need to work together in Afghanistan to try to stop radicalization there. Yes, I think that they would have less of a problem of people trying to cross into Afghanistan if it were a more pleasant place to live in Xinjiang. Right.
Okay, let's pull in Professor Ankerson on this. Professor Ankerson, the points that Mr. Gao made, is basically saying that, if we deal with radicalization this side and we spared the fallout of that radicalization to the NATO ISAF troops, but now the U.S. is turning around and saying, well, you're going in for human rights violations and the rest of it. So what are you going to say to that?
I think where somebody puts a line about what is radical and what is not radical clearly is relatively arbitrary. I would also say that along the lines of what has been said before, human rights issues domestically are clearly issues that every country in the world could improve upon, whether that's the United States, whether that's China, whether that's India, Pakistan, or any other country. So the use of these issues as bargaining points, I think, is really what we're seeing here. And to that end, for example, China has been called upon repeatedly to release the two Canadian private citizens that it's holding as bargaining chips, the two Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, in a row between the United States and China over Huawei and the detention under house arrest in Canada by the former CFO of the Huawei Corporation. So there are lots of issues here that are on the table. Taking them one by one or individually, it's easy to make a meal out of any of them. I'm not sure that China acted with NATO's best interest at heart when it was sealing the border between Afghanistan and China, but all of these issues, as we said before, can be seen in a positive light or in a negative light, depending on how the framework is set. And clearly, there's an intentionality by actors on both sides to use these as leaping off points, as a way of beginning a conversation. Right. And really, all of them need to be dealt with, but it's how they're going to be dealt with, where those lines are going to be drawn. Where do we see radicalization being an issue? Is it at the point where we hold an entire population hostage in order to perhaps deter a handful of real radicals, or do we deal with this on a more collaborative basis? I think that radicalization of any kind is an opportunity for the United States and China to have a meaningful, substantive dialogue rather than using it as a bargaining chip.
Right. Intertwined, let's hope that that actually happens. That was Dr. Christopher Ankerson speaking with us. Mr. Victor Gao, repeatedly there is a sense that perhaps, and of course, I mean, it also requires on the US side to stop using the issue of Xinjiang and human rights as a stick to beat China with, and to actually try and engage China on this. And that's something that people have been talking about. As a matter of fact, I had Mr. Einar Tangen on my program, who also conceded that perhaps China needs to open up a little with reference to Xinjiang. So once again, and I know I asked you this before also, is there space for that kind of cooperation?
For one of our distinguished panelists who mentioned about the Uyghur languages, etc., allow me to make this point. I think for a true believing Muslim, it is impossible to take away their faith in Islam. Anyone, any government, anywhere else who wants to try to do this will fail. Now, I believe to respect our Uyghur brothers and sisters' religious faith is a precondition of anything we talk about in terms of our work in Xinjiang. Now, having said that, for a Chinese-speaking person whom I was born to, for me to learn English, does that mean I lose my Chinese identity? No, it enhances my Chinese awareness. So to learn a foreign language does not mean you need to abandon your own language or your cultural heritage. It's the same thing for Uyghur brothers and sisters. How can you imagine living as a citizen in China, you do not understand the Mandarin Chinese, you cannot speak the official language of China. Now, in order to have a better job, in order to have greater mobility, in order to earn more living, for example, to better support your family, you need to speak both Uyghur language as well as the Mandarin Chinese. That's a part of being a citizen of the People's Republic of China. We know this. If you are a Canadian, you need to speak both English and French. Do people say, by legally requiring me to speak English, you are depriving me of my French heritage? That's absurd. So I think the rest of the world, especially people in the United States and in some European countries, really need to know what they are talking about.
Okay, now this is a good point. We also welcome Andrew K.P. Leung to the program, who's chairman of Andrew Leung International Consultants and an independent China strategist. So, Mr. Leung, we've had a discussion with reference to Xinjiang and the rest of it. But now you're talking about, given the confrontational sort of tone, how are these two biggest economies going to interact? And you just heard Professor Lal, who thinks that, despite all the rhetoric and posturing and the rest of it, it's not something where they're going to pull apart so completely. And she, of course, gave the example of the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. You obviously look into this issue very, very closely. So give me your sense of what you think, juxtaposing the confrontational rhetoric with areas where cooperation is and convergence is very, very important for both sides.
Well, the concept of what is called Chimerica, I think there was a term coined by Neil Ferguson, that the two countries are bound together, almost joined at the hip, as it were. True, there's to a certain extent, this is happening, especially with a world which has become totally interconnected and interdependent. But that was all rhetoric. Now, because by helping China to join the World Trade Organization, hoping that China would become more like the United States, I think that these hopes have become forlorn. And then the United States beginning to feel threatened by the rise of China, not only in terms of trade or technology, but China is becoming more and more influential, threatening Americans' dominance, and also the so-called American-led liberal order. Bearing in mind that China's system is entirely different, it's got a different ideology, its economy is based on state capitalism as against Americans' more liberal kind of liberal capitalism. And then its perceived transgressions on human rights and so on and so forth are threatening Americans' values. And so this is a whole new rhetoric. And true, there are areas where the United States want China to cooperate, and for example, on climate change and on North Korea. And of course, the United States want China to buy more of its agricultural products and various other things that would be in Americans' best interest, without regard to what China regards as its own interest. And that's really the crux of the matter, because behind it all is the belief that America is an exceptional country, is a city on a hill, and its own model seems to be embraced by many countries around the world, and the belief that China's system is somehow illegitimate. That's really rubbing salt into China's own wounds of being talked down upon, being oppressed by the West, and so on and so forth. Now, the China now is very, very different from what it was about 20 years ago. China is a much more influential country. Its economy is the world's second largest, and soon to overtake that of the United States. But somehow the United States cannot live with this reality, and that's what's happening.
Right, but that's actually the problem. And the reason I say that's the problem is because the 24-page document that was put out by the Biden administration back in March said, and I quote from that about China, it's the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. So, Mr. Leung, here's the thing. So there's obviously the competition and the concern that China might overtake the United States in terms of its military modernization and in terms of its technological prowess and the rest of it. But also the global security architecture, the post-World War II architecture, which if you were to consider it as a pyramid, the United States sits at the apex of that. And so that's also then a concern in and of itself. Given that, where do you think this is heading?
Well, on the security architecture, as you referred to just now, I think what happened during the old Cold War is quite instructive, because in those days, there is not much economic connection between the United States and the former USSR. But now it's quite different. The United States and China are much more interdependent, even not totally, especially on technology on the high end. But then on the military side, I think both countries are nuclear armed. And then China has shown its nuclear capabilities of being able to survive the first nuclear attack even. So I think that this, and also China, even though in terms of the nuclear stockpile, is only a fraction of that of the United States. But on the other hand, China's got quite a number of intercontinental.
I think we are already headed in a direction where, given the emerging technologies, the entire idea of conflict is going to undergo a major change. But thank you so much. That was Andrew K.P. Leung speaking with us. I'm almost out of time. Very quickly, Mr. Gao, any last words you want to say with reference to U.S.-China relations?
Thank you very much. Please allow me to inject a positive note. I've been calling for the inevitable peace between China and the United States as a rebuke to the so-called destined to war. I truly believe, as both nuclear-armed countries, China and the United States cannot afford to fight a war against each other. And by default, peace will be everlasting between China and the United States, even though there are people in Washington who are agitating for a war against China. Now, with inevitable peace, we know death is inevitable in one's life, tax is inevitable, and in today's world, peace is inevitable between China and the United States.
Right.
China and the United States need to figure out a way to get along with each other.
Right. It's interesting. It's a reversal of the securities trap that we talk about. So, Professor Lal, again, very quickly, I mean, there's like, I think almost 6 or 7 months ago, I had a long session with Professor John Mearsheimer, and we were, as it happened, we were discussing U.S.-China relations. And of course, you know, Professor Mearsheimer is a structural realist, so he said there is inevitability, not necessarily a hot conflict, but, and he said, I told the Chinese in Beijing, you know, look, if you want to get out of this trap, all you need to do is to make yourself wealthy. That doesn't bother the United States. But if you're going to translate that into, you know, military modernization, into projecting power in South China Sea and the rest of it, then there's going to be an inevitability with reference to the conflicts. So give me your view on that.
As much as I hate to admit it, I probably agree with a lot of what Mearsheimer says on that, in the sense that, you know, just getting wealthy, yes, it is a little bit of a threat, but unless they're buying up much of the U.S., I think it's fine. And I don't think that would bother people quite as much. The military growth, and in particular, not even as much the military growth, but the activities in the South China Sea and so forth, or statements against, for example, Taiwan and South China Sea and so forth. Those are the type of things that do make the U.S. more nervous. So, but I don't think it's inevitable. I do think that, like I said, to me, you know, when the U.S. and China can focus on the economic relationship, it's very powerful. I think there's a lot of possibility for both countries to get working together, becoming even more powerful. And the U.S. can benefit, the Chinese can benefit. And so I think that it's just more of, we have to be careful with the rhetoric. We have to have deep and meaningful conversations. As much as we want to have the formal ones with the cute pictures of the leaders, I think it's very important to have the back, you know, conversations, the second track and third track, and just general relations between both countries.
I'm happy that we're ending this on a positive, optimistic note. Thank you so much to Victor Gao and Professor Roly Lal for being with us and sharing their insights with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Lebanon's politico-economic problem. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Lebanon's business tycoon and former Premier Najib Mikati is poised to be designated Prime Minister. He won the support of most major parties Monday to form a new government. One of his endorsers is Saad Hariri, who abandoned his effort to form a new government last week after nearly 10 months of failing to agree to its makeup with President Michel Aoun. Mikati has two main challenges: dealing with a fractured political system and aggregating interests of various factions, and responding to Lebanon's economic crisis that has pushed nearly half the population into poverty, while food inflation is at more than 400%. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Dr. Christian Tautel, Director, History and International Affairs Department at Beirut's Jesuit University. Thank you for being on the program, Christian. So the first obvious question would be, how is, Mikati, as I said in my opening, has been premier before, has been an MP, has been part of the power elite for a very long time, I mean, all his life, in fact. So how is he going to deal with the challenges which presumably he could not when he was the premier?
Well, let's say that to understand this actual situation, you have to go back to what is happening in Lebanon, what has been happening in Lebanon for the last year. On August 4, 2020, almost 11 months and a half, maybe 1 year and a few days, on August 4, we had this huge explosion in Beirut port. And a few days later, the government resigned. This government was led by Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri. The government resigned, and our government was unable to run the country since this resignation, and no new government was placed to replace the one of Saad al-Hariri. So Lebanon has been now for almost 12 months without a government, and the only solution possible seems to be Najib Mikati. He's not popular in Lebanon. The two main Christian parties in Lebanon did not vote for him as a prime minister, so he's kindly not popular at all. Actually, he's accused of many corruption cases. Nothing was proved yet, but many accusations of corruptions. Actually, there is one judge, a very famous judge of corruption in Lebanon, still having a case about Mikati. So it's funny because we talk about him in the news as the next prime minister, but at the same time, minutes later, we talk about him as someone who has some cases with the justice.
Right. So that's the problem. And you're right. I mean, there are these cases. And it seems that there are these structural binds into which Lebanon is caught. Now, some people also say that perhaps Mikati will be able to sort of get the French help. Apparently, Macron had an initiative with reference to helping Lebanon. Now, is that something on the cards, or is this something that's not really going to happen?
Let's understand better the French position. France is not saying that they will give the help to Mikati's government. France is saying that they will give the help to any government that is formed in Lebanon. The problem is that, as I said earlier, the Lebanese parliament, the MPs have been unable to form a government for a year. So now France is looking for having someone to talk to, and it seems that Mikati is the only solution today.
Okay. So one of the reasons Hariri abandoned the quest for making a government was because, and he said openly to Al Jadid and other interviews, he said it's because of Michel Aoun. So now Mikati and Aoun have met. Do you think that Mikati will be in a better position to form the government and the cabinet and actually succeed where Hariri had failed?
Well, personally, I think it's very personal, but I think that Mikati will face the same problems that Saad al-Hariri was facing with President Michel Aoun. Michel Aoun has a very big issue to deal with. He is unable to let anyone govern with him. He seems that he wants to be the only one ruling the country, and the only team around him is a team formed by his family. Like, I think that you know about Gibran Bassil, that is married to the daughter of the president, and he is actually the most important man in Lebanon today after the president. So I hope that Mikati will be able to do anything different than Saad al-Hariri, but I have my doubts. Mikati is someone who will try to have his own team. He is in the right to have his own team to rule with him, but I don't think that Michel Aoun will make it easy for him.
Right. So unfortunately, it seems from what you're saying that the situation is no closer to getting resolved, and there's also the issue of, as you mentioned yourself, and rightly so, Mikati's usurpation of power and corruption cases. It seems that it will be extremely difficult for him to actually get the trust of the people. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Christian Tautel speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.